The Working Capital Cycle by Ryan Williams, Jack Bruce and Ryan Quinn. We have been tasked with the overall topic, the working capital management. The topic within this area is the working capital cycle, which has a key problem, which is a lack of efficiency within the cycle itself. What is the working capital cycle? The working capital cycle is a cycle that works out the amount of time it takes to turn the net current assets and current liabilities into cash for a business. How to work out this working capital cycle? Shown on the screen is an example in order to how to work out this working capital cycle. As you can see, we have 60 days, 30 days and 0 days. 0 days is when the stock is ordered in order to make the product. In this case, we'll use football goalposts to explain. 0 days is where the raw materials are ordered in. 30 days is where the suppliers for these raw materials are paid out by the company. And then 60 days is when the final payment for the goalposts comes from the customer of the company. As can be seen below, it states 60 days minus 30 days equals 30 days, showing the working capital cycle for this company is 30 days. The more efficient the working capital cycle, the smaller the number of days. For example, Tesco is a key example due to their quick turnover of stock each and every day. How to work out working capital itself? You do current assets, for example, cash and inventory, minus current liabilities, for example, bank loans and bank overdrafts. Taking liabilities away from the assets, we reach the result which is working capital. Why is an efficient working capital cycle important? There are 4 main reasons for this being an important part of every business. The first one, they don't have to finance the company through expensive means. For example, if it's only a 4 or 5 day finance period, this can be achieved a lot easier rather than going through bank loans and bank overdrafts, which come with high interest rates and high costs for a business, which can impact eventually on profit and could cause the business to go into administration, bankruptcy, etc. The second reason is there is more cash in the business. If cash is coming in quicker and more often, therefore there is more cash within the business at all times. And as we know, cash is king within a business. The third reason for the working capital cycle being efficient, it shows a strong position of the business. For example, if a business can put off paying their suppliers for an extra 10 days, but can demand their payments quicker from customers, it shows that they're in a strong place in the market as they can determine the conditions on which they're paid and which they pay. A key example of this once again is Tesco, who can put off paying their suppliers for quite a long period of time, but customers must pay as soon as they buy the products. Finally, it shows a good relation with the customers. If a good relation with customers is there, it means you can slightly push the boundaries on how long you're going to pay and how quickly you can be paid. Obviously, as mentioned before, if it takes a while to pay your suppliers, and customers pay you quickly, it means it's going to be a lot less financing through expensive means for the company itself, keeping these costs down, meaning they can be spent on other areas. For example, widening and expanding the business, which is an important part of every business. The cycle is shown here in 4 key steps, each of which I'll explain. The first step, the raw materials are purchased from the suppliers and stored until production. As mentioned before, we'll use the example of football goalposts. This would be, for example, the metal and the screws and everything else that's used to make these, with the nets as well. These will be purchased from a supplier and stored within the business until production. Number 2, the production process. This is where the materials will be put together through labourers and employees of the business and creating the goalposts. Incurred costs here are factory costs such as your overheads and running it, insurance and everything. Labour through obviously employees putting the goalposts together, setting them up, making sure they're all ready and safe to be used at a high standard. Again, this incurs costs, as does point 1. The third area of the working capital cycle is the storing period. And this is where costs are incurred to store a product till a customer is found. Ideally, the company will want this to be as short as possible, as storage can be a very heavy cost on companies, especially if it is a big product, which in football goals case they are quite a large product, therefore it could incur a high cost. The final area of the cycle is where the money is gained for the company from the customer. This is where the product is sold, the customer then pays for the products, and cash is therefore generated. This is important to happen. It is important this point on the cycle is reached as quickly as possible, as if this takes a long time to come, it means the working capital cycle could become inefficient, especially if suppliers are paid quickly. An efficient working capital cycle. As we can see, 50 days is when the customer pays us. 41 days is when the supplier is paid, therefore 50 days minus the 41 days is 9 days. This means only a short period of time needs to be financed, which is important in order to keep the company as highly effective as possible and as competitive in the market as possible, as it means cash will be flowing through the business a lot quicker than if it was an inefficient cycle, which will be shown next. An inefficient working capital cycle. This is a nightmare for any company, as it means they are having to finance this period through the likes of expensive loans, overdrafts, etc. In order to run as an efficient business, it is ideal for a company to keep this period as low as possible. As we can see here, it's 60 days to be paid from the customer and 15 days to pay your suppliers. Therefore, we've got 60 days minus the 15 days, which is 45 days. Which in terms of weeks is just under 7. It is important that the company would try and reduce this, which we mentioned later on in the presentation. However, 45 days here is evidently an inefficient cycle. The key problem with working capital cycle, which will be discussed later on again in the presentation, is inefficiency. If it's inefficient, as I've mentioned before, it means the company will struggle to run as efficiently within the market and be competitive, as they are always waiting and having to finance the income which they're waiting on. Therefore, a key point from this part of the presentation is if a company wants to run at the best possible way, it is important that they have an efficient cash cycle which is kept as low as possible. One key example of a good working capital cycle is supermarkets in general, because obviously they can, especially the big ones such as the Tesco, Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, they can put off paying their customers, who in a lot of the cases are paying their suppliers, which in a lot of cases are smaller businesses such as farmers, etc. And they can take up to a good 30 to 50 days to pay these, dependent on the product and on the business. Whereas the customers have to pay as soon as they purchase the product. Obviously with credit cards it's between 2 and 3 days, but therefore they still have to pay within that short period. So a working capital cycle for the supermarkets is probably the best example there is, whereas Sports Direct, on the other hand, can have a relatively inefficient cycle, because they could order in coats, for example, and pay their suppliers and not sell these coats for 6 months, meaning they've got to store and stock these for 6 months, incurring the costs within the shops and within their storage areas.
Working capital provides a strong indication of a business's ability to pay its debts. Every business needs to be able to maintain day-to-day cash flow, needs enough to pay staff wages and suppliers when invoice payment terms are reached. It is vital for a business to maintain sufficient liquidity to ensure it can survive and grow in the long term. The current liabilities show the amounts that need to be paid in the next 12 months. Current assets show the cash and other assets that are available to settle those current liabilities. Assets are continually flowing in and out of a business. This is part of a short-term cycle called the working capital cycle. At the start of the cycle, the business uses cash to acquire inventories, known as stocks. The stocks are put to work and goods and services produced. These are then sold to customers. Some customers pay in cash but others buy on credit. Eventually they pay and these funds are used to settle any liabilities of the business, for example paying the suppliers. The cycle then repeats itself. An increase in the length of the cycle suggests that it takes longer to turn stocks and debtors into cash, or that the payment period for settling creditors has shortened. Hopefully, each time through the cash flow cycle, a little more money is put back into the business than flows out. The cash needed to make the cycle work effectively is working capital. It is very important that a business actively manages working capital. Money coming in and out of the business is more important than profit. It is the timing of cash flows which can be vital for a company in terms of making success. There are many factors that affect the level of working capital. Different industries have different working capital profiles reflecting their methods of doing business and what they are selling. For example, businesses with a lot of cash sales and few credit sales should have minimal trade debtors. Supermarkets are good examples of this. Businesses that exist to trade in completed products will only have finished goods in stock. Some finished goods, such as food products, have to be sold within a limited period of time because of their perishable nature. Large businesses may be able to use their bargaining strength as customers to obtain more favourable extended credit terms from suppliers. By contrast, smaller companies, particularly those that have recently started trading, may be required to pay their suppliers immediately. Working capital needs also fluctuate during the year. The amount of funds tied up in working capital would not typically be.
The shorter the working capital cycle is, the more effective your working capital cycle is. If the working capital cycle is too long, then your capital gets tied up in the operational cycle without earning returns. Therefore, companies try to achieve shorter working capital cycles to increase their business efficiencies. One way of shortening the working capital cycle is by getting the suppliers to accept a longer debt repayment period than what the normal period to pay back is. For example, rather than having a 30-day repayment period, getting the creditors to extend the repayment period beyond that, for example up to like 60 days, will allow you to have more cash in your business that can be used elsewhere. However, this approach will only tend to work if your business is substantially larger than your suppliers is, and they are therefore dependent on your business in order to continue running. Another way of shortening the working capital cycle is by getting customers to pay sooner rather than later. This can be done by incentivizing them through discounts. For example, if they were to pay back by a certain date, it would cost them less. And so not only would it benefit you by reducing your working capital cycle, but it would also reduce their costs and benefit them. This also minimises the risk of bad debts from customers not paying you back because it has been paid sooner. Also, improved record keeping, such as accurate and quicker invoices, means customers will pay sooner because they have less excuse to delay their payments. Another way of having a more effective working capital cycle is by managing stock actively with regular stock checks, which means there is less capital tied up in working capital and it can be used elsewhere in the business.